offense of attempted murder section 29 term 11 corrections as the specification 4 to count 1.
This is the story of a young woman who escaped war to find peace in America, but instead met a brutal death on a late-night train. This is the tragic story of Iryna Zarutska. Iryna Zarutska was just 23 years old. She fled Ukraine in 2022, escaping Russia's invasion, and started a new life in Charlotte, North Carolina. She worked hard, studied English, and dreamed of a safe future. At only 23, Iryna's life had already been marked by war, displacement, and sacrifice. Born and raised in Ukraine, she was part of a generation whose lives were suddenly torn apart when Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022. Like millions of other Ukrainians, she was forced to abandon her home, her friends, and the familiar streets of her childhood. She carried with her only the hope of survival and the dream of rebuilding her life somewhere safe. The journey to the United States was not simple. For Iryna, reaching Charlotte, North Carolina, meant entering an entirely new world. She arrived as a refugee, navigating a foreign culture, a new language, and the loneliness of starting over far from family. Yet, despite these challenges, she embraced her new life with resilience. She found work to support herself, determined not to be a burden but to stand on her own feet. At the same time, she enrolled in English classes, understanding that language was her key to independence and a brighter future. Neighbors and colleagues described her as kind, hardworking, and focused, someone who carried both the scars of her homeland and the determination to build something better in America. Above all, she dreamed of a safe future. A life where she could study, work, and maybe even one day have a family of her own. A future free from the sound of air raid sirens, free from the constant fear of violence, a future where peace was not temporary, but permanent. On August 22, 2025, around 10 p.m., Iryna finished work and boarded the Lynx Blue Line train. Tired but ready to head home, she could never have imagined this would be her final journey. That night was like so many others in Iryna's new routine. After a long day of work, she made her way through the quiet streets of Charlotte toward the Lynx Blue Line, the light rail system that thousands of commuters use every day. The train, with its familiar blue and silver cars, had become part of her daily life, a simple and affordable way to travel between her job and her modest apartment. The time was just past 10 p.m. The summer air was warm and heavy, and the station lights glowed against the darkness of the city. A handful of other passengers waited at the platform, some scrolling through their phones, others lost in thought after their own tiring days. Iryna stepped onto the train, as she had countless times before. She found a seat, perhaps near the window, quietly settling in for the short ride home. She looked tired, but this was the kind of exhaustion that came from hard work and determination, not despair. She had built a routine, a sense of normalcy, and this train was part of that fragile comfort. But what she could not know was that, just a few feet away, danger was already seated. Another passenger, someone she had never met, someone with a troubled and violent past, was about to change her life forever. For Iryna, the Lynx Blue Line that night was not a ride home, it was a path leading directly into tragedy. Just minutes after the train left the station, another passenger, later identified as DeCarlos Brown Jr., suddenly stood up, pulled out a knife, and stabbed Iryna 3 times. She collapsed, mortally wounded, in her seat. It happened so quickly that most passengers barely had time to process what was unfolding before their eyes. The train had only traveled a short distance, no more than a few minutes of smooth, uneventful movement through the Charlotte night. Some riders were listening to music, others scrolling on their phones, and Iryna herself appeared tired but calm, likely thinking of nothing more than getting home to rest after a long day. Then, without warning, chaos erupted. A man seated nearby, later identified as 32-year-old DeCarlos Brown Jr., rose suddenly from his seat. To witnesses, it seemed abrupt, almost unnatural. He looked agitated, his movements sharp and deliberate. Passengers would later recall a chilling stillness just before he acted, as if he had already made up his mind. In an instant, he pulled out a knife. The gleam of the blade under the dim train lights was enough to send shivers through those who saw it. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward. His target was not random in his mind, but to the world watching, it seemed senseless. He drove the knife into Iryna's body not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each strike was fast, violent, and devastating. She gasped, her body jerking from the force of the blows, then fell back into her seat. Shock swept through the car. A young woman who had only minutes earlier been alive, quietly riding home, was now slumped, bleeding, mortally wounded. The train's hum and the screech of its wheels against the tracks continued, but inside the car, screams filled the air. Witnesses described sheer panic. Some passengers froze in terror, unable to move. As the train screeched to a halt at the next station, chaos poured onto the platform. Passengers stumbled out, some screaming, some crying, others completely silent in shock. Several stayed behind, pointing at the attacker, ensuring police would know exactly who he was. The suspect, DeCarlos Brown Jr., made no attempt to flee. Reports say he appeared distant, almost detached from the horror he had just caused. When police boarded the train moments later, he was still there, knife in hand, as though waiting for what would come next. The crime scene that night was devastating. Officers found Iryna slumped against her seat, blood pooling beneath her. They attempted CPR, but the wounds were too severe. Within minutes, she was pronounced dead. News of the killing spread rapidly across Charlotte. A young refugee, someone who had come to the United States in search of safety, was now the victim of a brutal and senseless attack on public transit. For the passengers who had witnessed it, the images would never fade, the suddenness of the attack, the screams, and the sight of Iryna's final moments. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the timeline. They discovered Brown's troubling background, a man with a history of mental illness, prior arrests, and erratic behavior. But on that train, none of that mattered. To the strangers around him, he was simply a killer, and Iryna was his victim. The tragedy raised difficult questions. Could this attack have been prevented? Should Brown have been in treatment or under supervision? Should transit systems have more security to protect riders? For Iryna's family, those questions offered no comfort. What remained was the devastating reality: a 23-year-old woman, who had fled war in search of peace, lost her life in the most unexpected and violent way. The murder of Iryna Zarutska on that train was not just an isolated crime. It was a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be, and how violence can strike even in the most ordinary moments, on a ride home, on a train, in a city that was supposed to offer safety. Passengers screamed for help. The train stopped at the next station, and police rushed in. Brown was arrested on the spot. But for Iryna, it was too late. She died before medics could save her. The moment the knife plunged into Iryna's body, the train car was thrown into chaos. Screams erupted, echoing off the metal walls, blending with the screech of the wheels on the tracks. Passengers leapt to their feet in panic, some pressing against the doors, others fumbling for the emergency alarms. The cries for help were desperate, piercing, the kind of cries that come from people who know they are witnessing something irreversible. Several passengers shouted at the top of their lungs, waving their arms to alert anyone who might hear them outside. Others crouched in fear, clutching their children, afraid the attacker might turn on them next. The scene was a nightmare, a small, enclosed space filled with terror, confusion, and the sight of a young woman bleeding out in her seat. As the emergency brakes were triggered, the train began to slow, screeching loudly as sparks flew beneath its wheels. Every second felt like an eternity. Passengers begged the train to stop faster, desperate to escape the horror inside. Finally, the doors slid open at the next station, and the chaos spilled out onto the platform. Panicked commuters rushed onto the platform, some crying uncontrollably, others shouting directions to arriving officers. "He's still inside. He's still got the knife," one man screamed, pointing back toward the train. Another woman clutched her phone, trembling as she tried to describe the attack to 911 operators. Police officers, already alerted by frantic emergency calls, stormed onto the platform within moments. Guns drawn, flashlights cutting through the dim train interior, they advanced cautiously, prepared for a violent confrontation. But inside, they found a chilling sight: DeCarlos Brown Jr. Still sitting there, knife in hand, as though frozen in time. Witnesses would later describe how eerily calm he appeared. He didn't try to run. He didn't resist. Officers shouted commands, and Brown slowly set the knife down. He was handcuffed on the spot, dragged out of the train, and placed under arrest as stunned passengers looked on. The man who had unleashed so much terror was now subdued, but the damage had already been done. Behind them, officers turned their attention to Iryna. They found her slumped in her seat, her clothes soaked in blood. First responders moved quickly, calling for medics, applying pressure to her wounds, and attempting CPR. Passengers huddled on the platform, praying, whispering, some weeping openly as they waited for a miracle. But it never came. The knife wounds had been too deep, too precise. The damage was catastrophic. By the time paramedics arrived, Iryna's pulse was fading. They worked frantically, their voices urgent, their hands moving fast. Oxygen mask, chest compressions, emergency equipment rushed into the train car. But within minutes, the truth was undeniable. Iryna Zarutska was gone. Word spread quickly among the crowd. Some broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, while others stood in shocked silence. Strangers embraced each other, united in grief for a young woman they had never met, but whose final moments they had just witnessed. One passenger whispered through tears, "She looked so young. She didn't deserve this." Outside, the flashing blue and red lights of police cars painted the night sky. Officers secured the scene, tape was stretched across the platform, and investigators began documenting every detail. But no amount of evidence gathering could undo what had happened. For Iryna's family, thousands of miles away, the devastating news was only just beginning to travel. A daughter who had escaped war, who had crossed an ocean for safety, had been killed in the very place she believed would protect her. The arrest of Brown provided little comfort in that moment. Yes, the attacker was in custody. Yes, justice would be pursued. But the haunting truth remained: for Iryna, it was too late. She died before medics could save her. Investigators revealed Brown's troubling past, a history of criminal charges, diagnosed schizophrenia, and bizarre claims that he was being controlled by man-made forces. It raised one haunting question: why was a man this unstable still roaming free? As police pieced together the events of that August night, a disturbing portrait of DeCarlos Brown Jr. began to emerge. This was not a random man with no history. His name was already known to law enforcement. His past was littered with red flags, each one a warning that, if ignored, could end in tragedy. And it did. Court records revealed that Brown had been arrested multiple times in the years prior. Charges ranged from disorderly conduct to violent altercations. Though many of these incidents were dismissed or reduced, they left behind a trail of warnings. Family members, neighbors, and even social workers had raised concerns about his mental health long before the attack on Iryna. Brown had been formally diagnosed with schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that, without treatment, can distort reality itself. His medical files contain chilling details: delusions, paranoia, and violent outbursts. Doctors noted that he often spoke about forces beyond his control, unseen enemies manipulating his mind, shadowy figures following him, and what he once called man-made forces that controlled his every move. To many, these claims sounded bizarre, even nonsensical. But for investigators, they revealed something much darker: a man detached from reality, driven by hallucinations and voices no one else could hear. Yet despite all of this, Brown was not confined to a psychiatric facility. He was not under consistent medical supervision. Instead, he drifted in and out of jail cells, courtrooms, and short-term treatment centers, a revolving door system that seemed designed to fail both him and the public. In interviews after the stabbing, mental health experts pointed out a tragic pattern. The signs were all there: untreated mental illness, a history of arrests, escalating delusions, and repeated contact with authorities. Each time, he slipped through the cracks. Each time, he was released back into the community. And each time, the risk of violence grew. Neighbors later described Brown as unpredictable. Sometimes he was quiet, keeping to himself. Other times, he ranted loudly in public about being watched, followed, or controlled. One former acquaintance told reporters, "We all knew he needed help, real help. But no one ever stepped in long enough to make a difference." The most haunting detail wasn't just his diagnosis or even his criminal record. It was the fact that, in the weeks leading up to the attack, Brown had allegedly told people around him that he was hearing voices again, voices that commanded him to act. Whether anyone took those warnings seriously remains unclear. For investigators, one question quickly overshadowed everything else: how could a man with this history, a man already known to the system as violent and unstable, still be free to step onto a public train with a deadly weapon? The tragedy of Iryna's death wasn't just the act of violence itself. It was the series of failures that allowed it to happen. Failures of a mental health system stretched too thin. Failures of a justice system more focused on short-term punishment than long-term solutions. And failures of a society that often looks away until it's too late. This wasn't just the story of one unstable man and one innocent victim. It was a story about the dangerous gap between mental illness and public safety, a gap that claimed Iryna's life. Brown was charged with first-degree murder. Federal prosecutors also indicted him under laws covering violent crimes on mass transit. If convicted, he could face the death penalty. In the days following Iryna's murder, the case moved swiftly from shock and grief into the halls of justice. Investigators compiled evidence, witness statements, security camera footage from the Lynx Blue Line, and the knife itself, still stained with blood. Every piece pointed directly to one man, DeCarlos Brown Jr. The charge was immediate and severe: first-degree murder. In North Carolina, that charge carries the harshest of penalties, including life in prison without parole, or even death. But this case was not confined to state courts alone. Because the attack took place on the Lynx Blue Line, a mass transit system partially funded and regulated under federal law, the U.S. government stepped in. Federal prosecutors announced an additional indictment, charging Brown under laws specifically designed to punish violent crimes committed on trains, buses, or planes. This elevated the case to a national stage. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps as the indictment was read. The language was chilling: a premeditated act of violence carried out on public transportation, resulting in the death of an innocent civilian. For the community, it wasn't just about one victim anymore. It was about public safety, terrorism fears, and the vulnerability of everyday commuters. Legal analysts quickly weighed in. The federal indictment meant Brown could now face the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. Prosecutors argued that the brutality of the attack, combined with the fact it occurred on a public train filled with passengers, justified the harshest possible sentence. Defense attorneys, however, painted a different picture. They pointed to Brown's long history of schizophrenia and mental illness. They argued that his mind was broken, that he was not capable of rational thought, and that execution would amount to punishing a man for being sick. This set the stage for what promised to be a long, bitter legal battle: justice versus mercy, punishment versus treatment. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Members of the Ukrainian community sat quietly in the gallery, many clutching small flags or wearing blue and yellow ribbons in Iryna's honor. For them, this was not just a case file or a headline. It was personal. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice for a young woman who had escaped one war, only to be killed in what was supposed to be her safe haven. Meanwhile, Brown appeared in court shackled, dressed in an orange jumpsuit. His expression alternated between blank stares and quiet muttering, at times speaking to no one in particular. Journalists noted how detached he seemed, as though he barely comprehended the gravity of the proceedings. The indictment sparked a wave of public debate. Should the death penalty be applied to someone with a severe mental illness? Or would that itself be an injustice? And at the heart of it all lay the memory of Iryna Zarutska, a 23-year-old refugee who had done nothing wrong, whose only mistake was boarding the wrong train at the wrong time. As the trial loomed, one thing was certain: this would not be a quiet case lost in court records. It was set to become a landmark battle between mental health, public safety, and the limits of justice in America. Iryna's family was devastated. They said she had survived war only to die in America. Her dreams, of education, of peace, of a better life, were stolen in one night of senseless violence. When news of Iryna's death reached Ukraine, the shock was immediate and unbearable. Her parents, who had watched their daughter flee Russian bombs in 2022, believed she had finally found safety in America. They had spoken to her often about her new life in Charlotte, her English classes, her part-time job, her excitement about maybe going to college. To them, America was supposed to be the place where fear ended and the future began. Now, they were left with only grief. She survived the war, her mother whispered through tears to reporters, but she could not survive America. Those words cut across continents, carried in headlines from Kiev to Washington. Her family described her as ambitious and kind, someone who believed in hard work and never gave up. As a teenager in Ukraine, Iryna had studied late into the night, determined to one day live abroad, learn new languages, and build a future free from violence. The invasion of her homeland forced her to flee earlier than planned, but she had adapted quickly. In Charlotte, she threw herself into rebuilding her life, working long hours, saving money, and dreaming of a university degree. Friends in the US remembered her optimism. They recalled how she volunteered at a local Ukrainian community center, helping new arrivals translate documents and find housing. Despite her own struggles, Iryna had always looked for ways to lift others. Now, that bright future was gone. Her life, filled with hope and resilience, was extinguished in minutes on a train ride home. The brutality of her death shattered not only her family but also the community that had embraced her. In Ukraine, her relatives gathered around old photographs. Iryna as a child in school uniform, Iryna smiling with friends, Iryna standing proudly at the airport with her ticket to the United States. Each image was now a memory, each dream frozen in time. Her father said quietly, "She left one battlefield and found another." The Ukrainian diaspora in Charlotte held candlelight vigils. Dozens stood in silence, holding flowers and small candles, their faces illuminated by the soft glow. Some prayed, others wept, many simply stood together in stunned disbelief. They mourned not only Iryna but also the cruel irony of her story, escaping war, only to die at the hands of violence in a land that promised safety. Internationally, her case sparked outrage. News outlets in Europe and the US questioned how America, a country that welcomed refugees, could fail so catastrophically to protect one. Her story became a symbol of both resilience and tragedy, a reminder of how fragile the promise of safety can be. For her family, the grief was immeasurable. They were left with empty rooms, silent phones, and dreams cut short. Her mother said she still expected Iryna's calls, still heard her laughter in the house. Her younger siblings asked why their sister had to leave, why she couldn't come home. There were no answers, only tears. Iryna's funeral was held in her hometown in Ukraine, under gray skies heavy with sorrow. Friends, neighbors, and strangers came together to honor her. The church filled with flowers and candles, the air heavy with prayers. Outside, mourners whispered the same thought again and again: she survived war, only to die in America. And so, the story of Iryna Zarutska became more than just a crime. It became a tragedy of global proportions, a young woman's hope destroyed, a family's heart broken, and a haunting reminder of how violence can reach even those who run the farthest from it. The killing shook Charlotte and beyond. People demanded answers. Is public transit truly safe? Are mentally ill offenders being ignored? And above all, are refugees really protected in the places they turn to for safety? The days after Iryna's murder were marked by grief, but also by anger. Vigils turned into protests. Local residents held signs outside transit stations reading, "Justice for Iryna," and "Safety First on Public Transit." Strangers who had never met her spoke with reporters about their own fears, late-night rides on empty train cars, poorly lit stations, and a system that now felt unsafe. In Charlotte's city council meetings, questions poured in. Commuters asked if the Lynx Blue Line, once a symbol of modern urban progress, was now a danger to anyone who dared ride it at night. Parents demanded more security, more cameras, more officers riding the trains. The city promised reviews and reforms, but trust had already been shaken. Beyond Charlotte, the case touched on something even deeper: America's failure to address mental illness. Experts on television panels repeated the same point: this tragedy wasn't just about one man with a knife. It was about decades of underfunded mental health care, jails becoming substitutes for hospitals, and a system that repeatedly failed to intervene before disaster struck. How many warnings, they asked, must be ignored before something changes? The outrage didn't stop there. Across immigrant and refugee communities, Iryna's death sparked painful reflection. Families who had fled violence wondered aloud if they were truly safe in America. Some Ukrainian refugees admitted they now avoided riding public transit at night. Others said the attack made them question whether the promise of refuge in the West was real, or just an illusion shattered by violence. At a candlelight vigil, one speaker summed up the community's pain. Iryna came here for peace, for education, for a life free from fear. Instead, she found death on her way home from work. If this can happen to her, it can happen to anyone. National news outlets picked up the story, turning Iryna's name into a symbol of both hope and heartbreak. Editorials asked whether America was living up to its duty toward those who sought protection within its borders. Politicians faced mounting pressure to explain why a diagnosed schizophrenic with a criminal past was allowed to walk free with no meaningful supervision. In the end, the questions remained heavy, unresolved, and haunting. Is public transit truly safe? Are mentally ill offenders being ignored until it's too late? And above all, are refugees genuinely protected in the countries they flee to for sanctuary? For Charlotte, for America, and for all those who followed Iryna's story, these questions lingered like shadows. And for Iryna's family, there was no debate, no policy solution, no speech that could change what had happened. Iryna Zarutska's death is more than a tragedy, it's a reminder. Peace is not just the absence of war, it requires justice, safety, and compassion. Until then, every Iryna who seeks refuge remains at risk. As the credits near, the screen fades to black and white images of Iryna, her smiling face, her graduation photo, snapshots of her life in Charlotte. Over these images, the narrator's voice carries the weight of finality. Iryna's story does not end on that train. Her life, her dreams, and her untimely death now live on as a question for all of us. What does safety really mean? Is it simply the absence of bombs, the silence of gunfire, or is it something more? For Iryna, survival meant starting over. Learning a new language, working long hours, and building hope from the ground up. She did everything right. And still, she was not safe. True peace is not guaranteed by borders or by distance. It is guaranteed by justice, by safety nets that catch those who fall through society's cracks, by compassion for the vulnerable, the refugee, the commuter, the mentally ill, the stranger on the train beside you. Without those things, safety is only an illusion. Tonight, as candles flicker in Charlotte and prayers rise in Ukraine, we are left with the reminder that until systems change, until societies choose care over neglect, every Iryna who seeks refuge remains at risk. Her life was short. Her dreams were stolen. But her story, painful, tragic, unforgettable, may yet light the path toward change.